Welcome everybody. Happy Friday. Happy Memorial Day Friday. I guess I've sort of forgotten myself that it's technically a 3-day weekend for many folks. So hopefully you're doing something fun to celebrate even in this crazy time of quarantine. I hope you're all well. We're excited. This is our penultimate virtual tasting. We've got one more next week. So today we're really excited to tackle harvest and winemaking. Hopefully those of you who were with us last week had a chance to watch the video that Mike put together. It's on our website, so you guys can check it out if you haven't already. Kind of cues us up for today. As always, our brief little housekeeping reminders. We've got a chat going and a Q&A. Please send your questions along. This time we had so much information to get through last time, and
so we've tried even more information this time.
Yeah, we've set a bar for ourselves, but we are really going to try and watch the clock and leave some time for questions. So send those along. Of course, as always, please change your chats to all panelists and attendees if you want to chat with the whole group and send messages on to us. And so this time around, we've got some fun props. We're going to take it easy on the video and the technology sharing today. You can see Mike is setting up we're starting some fermentations over here.
Not sure how this is going to turn out, but we'll.
So yeah, we've got some fun props today.
Just keep one eye on this as we go.
Yeah, there we go. So you can see we've got some yeast going there. So yeah, let's jump into it.
Yeah. So I wanted to start by saying winemaking is confusing, at least to me, and I sort of realized a long time ago that you could ask the same winemaking question to 10 different people and get 10 completely different answers. And I think that's partly because there are literally thousands of variables that are important to the way wine actually turns out. So it is, wine in general is something that it's difficult to do good science in, partly because there's no clear definition of what makes a wine best. Yeah. And sort of the quantitative differences between wines can be very hard to measure and interpret. And it's very difficult to reproduce experiments. Many of these variables are beyond your control. So I think this also sort of opens the door to all kinds of crazy claims in winemaking, and maybe crazy is not the right word, but there are people who play music to their wine barrels. There are people who make their winemaking decisions based on the phases of the moon and these other things. And we're going to try to avoid those topics in winemaking, and at least stick to the ones that make sense to us. And we're going to start. We sort of ended the last tasting, virtual tasting, with sort of getting to harvest. This time we're gonna start with what we're doing at harvest, why we make the picking decisions we do, and then try to carry that through red wines and white wines and sort of wind up at bottling and what we're trying to do there.
Yeah, so following the grapes journey in a sense.
Yeah.
You'll notice we have 3 wines out here today. So we've heard you loud and clear. Sometimes we get really caught up in chatting and we forget to drink, and this is above all a tasting. So we are not going to neglect those duties in particular today. So we're going to start right off the bat.
Trust me, if it looks like we're not drinking, we make up for that
later.
After.
Yeah. So we're going to start today. We've thrown in this Pinot Gris into the lineup today. That wasn't on sort of part of our original plan, but as we started thinking about what we wanted to talk about, we realized, we've got 2 wines here in the barrel fermented Chardonnay and the red that are both aged in oak, and this one is aged in stainless steel. And there are a variety of other decisions we make from a winemaking perspective that kind of distinguish this grape. So we thought it would be kind of fun to try today. We don't always have a lot of it. Those of you who have been with Hendry for a long time know that we used to make more Pinot Gris, but as Albarino became more popular for us, we actually grafted over a block of our Pinot Gris to Albarino. So we make less of it. It often goes to restaurants. That's not happening as much these days. So we ended up with a little more of it than usual. And so if you'd like some, let us know. We've got,
even though we only started with 100 cases. So
yes.
we're actually in the vineyard, we're down to just 1 acre of Pinot Gris.
Yeah.
And next to the mission, which we've already talked about, and I think most of you watching have bought all of at this point. This Albarino, the Pinot Gris, it's our next smallest production. So 100 cases is a tiny
yeah.
amount. And it's a light fresh style of wine. I find it somewhat floral. They're definitely, it's extremely aromatic. They're very nice fruit components.
A ton of citrus in here too. I think for me in particular, that's the kind of fruit that really jumps out. I think that our Albarino, by contrast, and I think people do often contrast these two wines, to me has a little more kind of stone fruit sometimes. And this to me is like all, a lot of lemon rind, that kind of thing. So yeah, nice and fairly, crisp and refreshing, especially as we're headed into summer. And so yeah, it's a nice one.
Yeah, and when you make a wine in that style, there are a series of very important winemaking decisions that you make if that's your goal. And we're going to sort of go through this and talk about some of the winemaking decisions that are required for that kind of wine style.
Yeah, exactly. So cheers.
Cheers.
Happy Memorial Day, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and bottoms up. All right, well, with that said, as Mike alluded to, there are decisions that you keep in mind. The final outcome of your wine is something you think a lot about, sort of all throughout the growing season, right? But really there are a couple of decisions that are important to winemaking that start even before the fruit gets to the winery.
Yeah, and when you pick is one of the biggest ones. It sets winemaking style in many ways. And the decisions leading up to that, I mean, really the things that we're watching as the fruit ripens are sugar and acid, which are really the two easiest things to measure, but ultimately maybe the least important because they're both things that you can adjust if you need to. Then there's a more broad topic of flavors, right? And we all have a sense of fruit that's underripe and overripe. I mean, we're getting our first cherries for the year right now, and maybe they're not quite ripe
you
yet.
Get a couple puckery ones every now and then.
Yeah. And then, we have this sense of, those strawberries that are amazing today and they're always kind of overripe tomorrow. That progression happens in grapes too. And as you go further, you sort of get to really raisiny flavors. The next big topic is sort of the ripeness of the phenolics. And this, it's a little bit vague in that there are a variety of phenolics. They include the tannins, the things that dry out your mouth. They include some of the bitter compounds in wine. They include the color compounds in wine. And these things don't necessarily reach peaks at the same time. For example, I sort of think of it this way. What I think of as unripe phenolics, it correlates very well to green seeds, right? And green seeds can be extremely bitter, extremely astringent, really tough on your mouth, and that can kind of translate through into the wine. The anthocyanins, the color compounds, they tend to reach a peak. That peak's often a little before we pick, actually. And then we sort of wait for the seeds to reach some level of ripeness that we like and try to pick. And so what we're after in a perfect year, we want all of these things, the flavors, the phenolics, the sugars, and the acids to reach the point we're looking for at the same time. And I can say for sure that sometimes that happens. Often it doesn't, and for different reasons. And I have to say too, we, really Megan here hired on as someone to help us out in the winery, but she is one of the few who's managed to cross over to the vineyard. And many people say they want to help with harvest. And then when you say, it's great, we're starting at 4 tomorrow morning, you learn that their interest level's not quite that.
It helps to be a morning person.
So, Megan's gotten out and participated in all of these harvest things as well as the stuff at the winery.
Yeah. And so we have a couple little tools to show you. Mike talked about all these different things that we look at. Some things I think it'd be sort of interesting to talk about. We've got here this refractometer, which is one way that we measure sugar. When we're sampling grapes, we squeeze up the juice. We'll pick a sample of berries from a particular block, squeeze it up, put the juice on here to test the sugar level. We can show you a little bit later how we test sugars once fermentation gets started. We've got a pH meter that was a little too bulky to bring in, so we're not doing that. But some of those other things, you're really relying a lot on taste, right?
Right.
You're sampling the fruit, you're tasting, you're checking out those seeds, you're sort of thinking about how it all feels. And I think that's where probably it's a lot of experience, right?
Right. But honestly, one of the problems for me is that it's hard to taste a ton of grapes. One, that they're relatively high in sugar, they're relatively high in acid. So and I do this every year, I wander around all day popping grapes into my mouth. And it eventually it feels like my tongue has sunburn.
Right.
And it's sort of, so you have to taste, and that's an important part of it, but you also have to rely on the numbers and sort of the weather forecast is another big part of it. Yeah.
Should we look at some of those numbers?
Sure. I want to show you first what the normal sugar increase kind of looks like. So this is some sugar samples that go back to 2006, and I picked that year because we did a lot of sugar sampling for one reason or another. But you can see it's the slope of that changes slightly, but in general, it's going up at about 1.7, 1.6 or 1.7 bricks per week. If the weather remains steady and warm, that's a pretty straight line. And if you get a longer, cooler stretch, that'll flatten out or even dip a bit. And if it gets warmer for a few days, you'll often see a sort of a sudden increase in that. But that's a pretty, I don't want to say typical, but that's kind of what you're looking for in a ripening curve, sort of steady, slow and steady.
Yeah. And as Mike said, that isn't always what we
get.
Let's
look at the pH too. This also, we're tracking the acid, and this obviously looks a lot noisier. I don't think that's necessarily related to real ripeness, but the pH meter can vary in its readings from day to day. But you basically get the impression here that as the sugar is going up, the acids are also going down. So this graph is showing you pH. And pH is really as pH, we've said this before, but it's the negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration.
Sure, you all remember that. But.
Yeah. And basically as acid goes down, pH goes up. So that's what you're seeing here.
Right. So that's what sort of ripeness looks like in an ideal year.
Right.
If we get it exactly where we want it, but sometimes that doesn't happen.
Right. So this is where things can get a little more complicated. These are 2 years that are sort of extremes of weather, and with Cabernet, the blue line at the bottom is their sugar samples from our Block 8B Cabernet in 2011. And in 2011, we were getting close to ripeness. Our last sugar sample was 23.4 or 23.3, and then it rained. And we didn't sample again for another 2 weeks, but right after the rain, the sugars actually went down, and then they recovered somewhat, but really 2 weeks later, they were essentially at the same level. In 2015, we got to a little over 24 bricks. We were probably, just about ready to pick. And then we had several days of 100+ degree weather. And literally within 3 days, we didn't sample in there again, but most of this sugar change happened even faster, and we went from about 24 bricks to 29 bricks in a matter of days. And when fruit gets to that level of sugar, more than anything, it has to do with the removal of water and not the plant actually putting more sugar into the grape. So this is how quickly things can diverge, and you can imagine that in terms of wine style and winemaking and what you need to do with the wines, you've got very different fermenters with those two lots of fruit in those years. So that's kind of the starting point. Right. We're gonna show off the way we pick. So yes. all of this fruit is really picked by hand. For us, harvest is usually spread out over almost 6 weeks. In some years, that's closer to 4 weeks, and when things get compressed and you do have those kind of heat waves. And in other years, again, sort of the ideal years, it's 6 or maybe even a little more. Last year was one of those years, but we go through and pick by hand. Megan's got a picking knife
here. See, it's kind of
everybody who has volunteered to help with harvest at some point has cut themselves with one of these. They're quite sharp, and you're sort of reaching into the plants and trying to cut the stems of the grapes. We have a bin that collects the grapes, and then we dump them, and then grapes that are picked here, they go on some journey to a winery somewhere. Ours, or it's usually just a few hundred yards. But most of you have probably been to Napa in harvest time, and you've also seen there's always a big production that's sort of made out of the sorting of fruit. And I sort of think this is the next step in the winemaking process. And I like to tell a story that there's always a big deal that's made out of this. There are always people standing around. Peter Heitz is, he's the winemaker for the Turnbull winery now. He's an interesting guy, and his family's been growing grapes here for a long time. But he told me a story. This is sort of a famous story at least among the winemakers that I know here. But he was working at a winery that had 4 different crews of 20 people each sorting grapes. So a huge number of people sorting, and a huge expense. And he decided, and to his credit, wanted to look at how much difference this was actually making. So what would normally happen is this fruit would come in, it would go through a sorting crew, and then it would wind up what was left would wind up in the fermenter. So he did this with one lot, and that was sort of the usual lot. He had another lot of the same grapes where he didn't sort it at all. It just went straight into the tank. And then he had a 3rd and 4th lot where it was fruit that was sorted 2 and 3 times. And the 5th lot was all the garbage that was going to be thrown away. The problem with sorting, I think, to a certain degree, is we sort of sit there and we want these perfect looking clusters going into the tank, but that doesn't necessarily translate to more complex or more interesting wine. Excuse me. So what Peter found out, he made these wines separately, he kept them separately. He put together a tasting panel. And the wine that was preferred in all of this tasting was the one that hadn't been sorted at all. The next favorite wine was all the garbage that they were throwing away. And then it was the fruit that was sorted once, twice, and 3 times in order after that. So, in his study, the more you sorted, the worse it got, which is thought-provoking at least. And he's the only person that I know that's gone to that sort of degree of effort to kind of make that happen.
And we should probably say what we're looking for when we sort, right? And this is, I think, one thing we benefit from is we have a wonderful vineyard team, and with incredible tenure here at Hendry. And so they really know what they're doing out there. And so, if there's something that's massively underripe or overripe, they're not bringing that in. But that's sort of the stuff, you're looking for, right? When sorting, or things that are, botrytis, any of that sort of bunch rot that you see.
The most important step in the sorting is in the vineyard, and if it doesn't look good or taste good, it shouldn't be picked or come to the winery, and they do a very good job of that. But you also have a chance again to look at the fruit as it's going by, look for anything that's sort of slipped in there, some second crop, something that's noticeably green. If you have any botrytis or bunch rot, that's kind of stuff that isn't always visible right when you pick it. So there are times when I think sorting can be very important and actually time consuming. And a lot of what takes place is maybe not so important.
Yeah. So we do that, and then we've got a decision. Are we crushing the fruit, or are we pressing the fruit?
Right. And so at this point, the winemaking for red and white wines start to diverge. Mm-hmm. And with white wines, there's a basic winemaking style where we really crush the whole clusters. There are a few different ways to do this with white wines, but what we do, and this is fairly common, we crush the whole clusters, remove the juice, and ferment the juice separately. What's in the seeds and the skins is what we've removed from the white wine, and that's what really contains the most phenolics. So when you're, the color compounds, the tannins, and a lot of the structure and the flavor in wine. What's very important in white wine are these aromatic compounds, and the aromatic compounds are expressed best in slower, cooler fermentations that wouldn't actually be very good at extracting phenolics as we need with red wines. So with the white wines, we take this juice and our fermentation temperatures, the thermostats and the fermenters are set to a little under 60 degrees, and then the fermentation proceeds slowly for a few weeks.
Yeah, and so Mike mentioned, we set that temperature because, again, we add yeast to, this juice that comes in, and it's producing the alcohol, which we of course love, but it's also producing heat, and so that is really what we're trying to, counterbalance here.
Right. And so controlling the temperature of the fermentation, it affects how the yeast functions, how rapidly it multiplies. It affects the phenolics that are extracted in some cases, affects the aromatics that are produced. So there are a lot of aspects to the temperature, and you need some means of controlling it. One way of controlling it, although not very mechanical, is the way we make the barrel fermented Chardonnay. And in that one, by putting it in a barrel and allowing it to ferment there, you have a relatively small fermenter with a bigger surface area. And if you put that in the cellar, it naturally keeps the temperature about 60 degrees without much temperature control. But if you fill a big fermenter with grapes, and if you put 15 tons of grapes in a single container, it'll reach a temperature that stops the fermentation and causes you more headaches.
Yes. But with red wines, there are a lot of, as Mike mentioned, those skins and everything have a lot of the, sort of phenolic compounds that we want to extract. So we actually want to keep the skins involved in that case. So in that instance, we are not pressing the grapes at that point, but we're sort of crushing them instead. And all of that's going into the tank at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's actually, there's a lot of complicated stuff that happens, and I certainly don't understand it fully, and I'm not sure that anyone does, but there's certain types of extraction. We do a cold soak typically with the red grapes. We'll put them in the tank, chill it down. This gives us a chance to measure what's in the fermenter. Really, you've done your sugar sampling, but you want to know more accurately, once you get that to the fermenter, how much sugar is there. You want to know also, very importantly, what nutrients are available to the yeast. So the yeast, in order to get the job of the alcoholic fermentation done, they need certain vitamins and levels of nitrogen, both in amino acid and ammonia forms. And these are things we can measure. If they don't have enough of those, the fermentation can proceed very slowly. It can stop altogether. And it can produce more off aromas and flavors, and starting in the form of hydrogen sulfide, and then maybe getting worse from there. So with both reds and whites, we will measure the available nutrition, add what needs to be added. And we also use sulfites at this time. Sulfites is a means of controlling the yeast that arrive with the fruit. And there are yeast in the vineyard that come in with the grapes. They're not the Saccharomyces cerevisiae that really I always say cerevisiae, but reading it today, it's actually spelled cerevisiae. So maybe I'll try to say that in the future, but
would know that.
Anyway, but you adding these sulfites prevents initial oxidation and sort of browning of the must, and also slows down this fermentation that wants to start the minute the fruit shows up.
Right. Yeah. And so as Mike mentioned, there is yeast out there that comes in with the fruit. And so when you hear people talk about, a natural fermentation, often what they're referring to is that yeast is sort of the one responsible for kickstarting, the fermentation that happens in the wine. But we are adding, as Mike demonstrated, we are adding yeast to all of our wines, with the exception usually of the Pinot.
So and what's interesting, this is a great book that's got a lot of,
can you hold it a little closer?
Big words and chemical drawings in it, but it actually lists more than 200 yeast that can potentially come in on the fruit. I mean, literally there are hundreds of potential wild yeast that come in. And so, and natural fermentation is a phrase you've probably heard. Really what it means is that you don't add a population of yeast and you let it start to ferment with what's there. And as you can imagine, when you have hundreds of potential yeast coming in, it's very difficult to, even if you make a wine that you've made the best wine in the world, you really don't know what it is that you've done. So it's less consistent. It's less consistent and less predictable, and it has a much higher risk in terms of wine spoilage. Some of these yeast can, they can spoil the wine in enough quantity. So really what finishes the fermentation everywhere is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, I'm now saying, which is the same yeast that's used in bread, and it's the same yeast that's used in beer.
Which we understand in quarantine, a lot of people are now baking and making their own bread. So it could be that you're already very familiar with this.
Actually, this happened to Molly and me because when we did finally, Molly can bake a nice loaf of bread, but she couldn't find any flour. And finally she found flour, but she said, I can't find any yeast. And then I thought for when it said that, there's a 30-pound bag of it in the refrigerator in the winery. So we've got plenty of yeast. Yeah. So maybe if you need some, Ange can ship some of that to you too. You can actually see that she's here today. I think on the side of your screen, you can see part of her computer. So
yeah. But
yeah,
yes, there she is.
So yeast is a big topic, and there are, when people talk, what we do here generally, and for the reasons that we want to limit some of the spoilage characteristics and have a fermentation that finishes in a reasonable time, we generally add a population of yeast. Now there's a lot of talk, we don't do that with all of our fermentations, but with most. There's a lot of talk about yeast strains sometimes too, and this is a big topic and an interesting topic. Yeast, although they're all doing the same basic job of converting the sugar to alcohol, some are more tolerant to higher alcohol levels, some are less tolerant, and there are yeast that produce different levels of aromatics. Certainly initially, it's less clear sometimes how these aromatic differences persist in the wine over time, but at least initially you can have some different different yeast that shows up. So what I'm going to do, I've got right here, I've got some Welch's grape juice. I'm going to feed my yeast in here, and we'll let this let this keep going. See if it likes to ferment this stuff. We'll see what happens. It's sort of starting to foam a little bit.
Yeah.
So far, so good. This is the first fermentation since October.
We tested that earlier today. So the sugar levels in there, as Mike said, we're looking at degrees bricks.
Should we do that?
Sugar. Yeah, let's do this.
Okay.
So we're picking.
Here, I'll let you spill it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm wearing black. It's okay. So we pick the fruit. We looked at those cab numbers. They're coming in around 28, 27 degrees bricks. And then, of course, that is what, part of what the yeast is eating for energy as they're conducting this fermentation. So we're expecting the sugars to go down. And here, our goal is to make dry wine, meaning, we don't really have any residual sugar left over. So this is something, once we start fermentation, this is how we measure the sugar. So we'll have a graduated.
This is how much sugar you're actually drinking with grape juice.
Yeah. So parents, maybe turn a blind eye at this moment. So, this is a hydrometer. It would bob. It's, it hits, you've got a measurement here where you can see up at the top. When it hits this point here, that's when there's 0 degrees bricks. So allegedly no sugar left in water. This is a hydrometer. So, we use this. We do have to make some adjustments once alcohol is being produced because the measurements are a little bit different. But we put this in here, and so this Welch's grape juice, which I did almost just spill, is coming in at about 16.5 degrees bricks.
Yeah, 165 grams per liter of sugar.
So
it's delicious.
No wonder it's so good. So,
but the idea basically, as you have more sugar in the solution becomes more dense. So then things that float higher, and you can put a scale on.
Yeah, bricks is actually, we're looking at sort of the density, as opposed to just.
And when we have the refractometer, it's really, so when we have the grape samples, we're using this.
Close, yeah.
And the other thing that happens as you get more sugar in a solution, the angle that light bends when it goes through the surface of that solution changes, and it's different versions of it's different symptoms of the same,
right. Which right? If you spill this on your counter, it's going to be really sticky. It's far more viscous as you drink it compared to a glass of water, and then especially compared to a nice glass of this Pinot Gris or something like that.
I thought we had a well-organized order we were going to do this in, and we're sort of.
We're still within the lane.
Skipping around.
Yeah,
okay.
Okay.
All right.
Let's get back on track.
So we talked about yeast, and this yeast is starting to bubble. We'll see what happens as time goes on. But from there, we at a certain point, the alcoholic fermentation finishes.
Yeah.
The Saccharomyces cerevisiae finishes its job. And then there's the question of malolactic fermentation. So I sort of think as I mentioned, literally there are hundreds of yeasts and bacteria that can play a role in winemaking. The two biggest and sort of most obvious fermentations are the alcoholic fermentation conducted by Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and even no matter what starts the fermentation, that's what finishes it. Then you have a fermentation that's conducted by bacteria. And what they're doing is really metabolizing mostly malic acid and converting that to lactic acid. So they're changing the types of acid within the wine, which can change the total acidity. We looked at pH, which is one measure of acidity, but another measure of acidity is what we call titratable acidity. So an acid is something that donates a proton to a solution, and some acids can donate more than others. pH is a measure of how many of those protons are in solution at one moment in time, but if you remove some protons, some acids give up more, and that can have an effect on the way you perceive the wine anyway. So in this malolactic fermentation, malic acid is being converted to lactic acid, and another one of the byproducts eventually is a compound called diacetyl. Now, it's sort of a byproduct of that. It's actually often a byproduct of metabolism of citric acid after that happens, but it's the same bacteria that are doing it mostly, and it tastes like butter or smells
like butter. Yeah.
And literally, it's what's on your microwave popcorn. It's the same stuff, and it's something that people really associate with Chardonnay. But with this Chardonnay in particular, we don't let it complete the malolactic fermentation anyway. There's always a certain fraction of the malic acid that's used up, whether you want it to or not. But then once the alcoholic fermentation is done, we limit further malolactic and get it to bottle certainly before it's complete.
So we do that by primarily trying to keep it as cool as possible, right? So we're putting it into the winery. We do put all of our red wines through malolactic fermentation because, as Mike described, there's sort of a stability component to that.
Yeah.
And so we want that in the red wines, and we don't typically pick up that aroma quite as much in the red wines. I will say I can think of one red wine I've ever had where I've detected some of that, but there's a lot of other stuff happening there aromatically, and so it's not quite as noticeable. But on these sort of lighter Chardonnays, it can really present sort of loud and clear. But when we're in the process of putting those red wines through malolactic fermentation, if you've ever been here in, November, say, and walk upstairs in the winery, we've got all the barrels up there because it's a little bit warmer. The bacteria kind of like that. They're more efficient in that environment. And so they're going to be conducting that. And then as soon as that process is done, we'll take them back downstairs into the barrel room where it's a little cooler, but we'll stick this straight into the barrel room. Right. That's our attempt to limit that.
Plus sulfites.
And
which are part of it. And so, and this kind of now brings us, I think, to the next big winemaking topic, which is barrels, in fact. And barrels, they're a big part of winemaking. They're a huge expense in winemaking. The barrels we buy are they're 225 liters, which means 300 bottles. But they can cost upwards of $1,200 a piece. So if you're buying all new barrels for this, that's $4 a bottle in cost at the production level. And obviously by the time that arrives either on a shelf somewhere or a restaurant list, that can be, you could be paying as much as $50 for the barrel it spent some time in. So with expenses like that, you obviously want to think carefully about it. Barrels are doing, I think, two important things. One is providing oak flavors, or at least the new barrels. And then there's also the issue of oxidation. And it's a little unclear. Oxygen's getting into the wine somehow, and oxygen is reacting primarily in red wines with the phenolics, and the red wine has a much greater capacity to absorb oxygen than white wines. And exactly how that oxygen's getting in there, whether it's getting through the barrel, whether it's part of the winemaking process, these are questions that aren't completely clear.
Or agreed upon.
Yeah. But certainly cellar aging, barrel aging in the wine, oxidation is a big part of it. So I do think sometimes a wine, there's no arguing that a nice glass of wine in the right moment is magical, but I think what's happening in wine is not magic, right? And I do believe sort of fundamentally that you can do all of the same things that a barrel does for far less cost. These things are they're less fun and less sexy. I think as far as most people are concerned, nice wine is supposed to come from a nice oak barrel. But really by somewhere here I have, these are oak staves. You can do things like this. They're a large class of aromatic compounds that come from oak.
Yeah, we'll talk about that with this wine.
Yeah, and the breakdown of cellulose and lignin, which are the two major wood components, turn into different things. And the aromatics you get and the sort of tannins you get, they depend on the type of oak tree. They depend on what part of the oak tree is in here, whether it's, you know, close to the bark or further toward the middle or higher or lower. And they depend how these things are aged and toasted. But you can really, I believe, achieve exactly the same thing by getting whatever ratio of new oak to wine volume you want. And then mimicking the sort of oxidation level, the oxygen exposure level that you get with barrels. But that becomes a tricky thing in winemaking, because many of the alternatives to using expensive barrels are sort of used as cutting corners and doing it on the cheap. So I don't think that's true personally, but many of you have been here and you know that we have a cellar full of oak barrels. So we do, at least for now, believe in the expensive oak barrels. But
yes. Yeah. And they do, you know, so it's, you know, Mike talked a little bit about some of the aromatics that they can provide, you know, that there are these other functions like the oxidation and everything. But we thought it'd be kind of fun, you know, as we taste through these, you know, one thing that we haven't really talked about in any of our tastings so far is what they call primary, secondary, and tertiary aromas. The primary, you know, that's all coming from the fruit. The secondaries, you know, those are going to be aromas that you get from sort of the winemaking process. So I think the diacetyl, that butter aroma that we talked about with malolactic fermentation, is a good example of one. So would be all of those aromas with the, you know, with coming from the oak. So, you know, people often attribute vanilla and cloves and, you know, those sort of warm spices and things like that. And so to me, that's, you know, when you're tasting and trying to sort of figure out, you know, say it's a blind tasting or you're just trying to understand a little bit more about the wine, sometimes those aromas can kind of be hints to maybe how the wine was treated. So for instance, this is our, you know, the 2017, we're excited. This is a new vintage. So we just released it. So it's kind of new to us as well. But if you've sampled our wines in the past and tried this versus the unoaked, to me, I definitely get a little more of the kind of warm spices. It feels a little warmer maybe than the unoaked.
Yeah, and I mean, the unoaked is made just like the Pinot Gris, that the idea, we don't let it go through the malolactic. So malic acid also, and I haven't mentioned that, this is the green apple acid. Mm-hmm. So I sort of think of, you know, a sour apple candy is basically malic acid and sugar and green food coloring.
Right.
So that malic acid is present in these wines. But the idea with the unoaked Chardonnay, again, is to really express or preserve that fresh fruit characteristic. With this one, there's more winemaking and there's an evolution of those flavors. It starts off, I feel like the fresh fruit moderates a little bit. There's a little more, like I think of it as melon almost. There's a little more melon in this wine to me. There's a little more honey. There's a little nuttiness that comes from both oxidation and the barrel aromatics.
Yeah, and those would be what they call a tertiary aroma. So the sort of third level would be, you know, all of the things that come from aging. You know, and this sits in a barrel for about 11 months or so just shy of a year. Compared to that unoaked or this Pinot Gris or the Albariño, which we're bottling much sooner in its life, if you will. And, you know, you start to get those sort of honeyed, in red wines, you might get a little more of that sort of tobacco and leather kind of stuff. And those are all going to be, you know, a result of aging. So a lot of, you know, wine wheels, this is the Wine Folly wine wheel. There are some really fun ones out there. You know, it sort of breaks things down. You know, most of this, 3/4 of this chart here describe a whole bunch of aromas, you know, that are primary. So all the fruit, all the floral herbs, you know, things like that can be attributed to the grape itself. And then they have a small little band here for sort of secondary aromas, then another little section here for tertiary aromas. So it's kind of a fun thing as you're tasting, if you kind of want to challenge yourself, is to think about all of those different sources potentially of those aromas, and it tells you a little something about how the wine's made potentially. Those
aroma wheels they're fun and they're useful, and there's actually a lot of very interesting sensory science that goes into how they're made.
Yeah.
I think Ann Noble from UC Davis developed the first of those, and she taught there for 30 plus years. I took the last class that she taught, and it was a pretty memorable one. She was a very, very, very good instructor, and there's a lot of fun aspects to those aroma wheels.
Yeah. So there are a lot out there, you know, this is as I said, the Wine Folly one, the Noble one is sort of a classic. So
right.
Pick one up sometime. But All right, let's move on because we've got more wine.
Okay.
So we put things in barrels. You know, the white, this Chardonnay is the only white wine that we put in barrel, as we've mentioned, but all of our red wines do go into barrel. So they are in the winery from a year to 2 years or so. It would be at this point that if we're going to do any blending, we do. So as many of you know, longtime Hendry fans, we really only have one blend in a sense, you know, multi-grape blend, and that is just called red. 5 different grapes there. A lot of people ask if we blend pre or post fermentation. This is blended post, about a year or so, give or take, about after fermentation is complete. So we'll do all the wines separately, put them into barrel, and then George will start the process of going through and figuring out how he wants to sort of knit it together. There are a handful of wines that will go into the same tank to start, you know, or a handful of vineyard blocks, I should say.
So we have different levels of blends, obviously. So we have 7 and 22. We have, you know, there are times, and that, you know, the Pinot is a blend of different blocks. And I think generally, from a winemaking standpoint, that the earlier you can make a blend, the better. But when you do make a blend, you've lost all your options. That's the downside. And sometimes, you know, because of the way harvest is progressing and what's happening, we'll even combine blocks and lots and fermenters that, you know, in another year we might do that separately post fermentation. But basically, you know, getting things together and letting the wine stabilize. We'll talk a little more about stabilizing wines in a minute, but you know, the sooner you can do it, the better. I don't know if you guys can see what's going on here, but the fermentation's sort of starting to kick off.
A bubble, and
we'll see what happens here in a few more minutes.
But yeah, so then, you know, we've got this period of time where the wines are, you know, the red wines are in the barrel room. We've got the Chardonnay in there as well. We might start doing some blending at that point. And so that's where we get this red. This is the 2015 red. 5 grapes. We use the 5 Bordeaux grapes every single year. This one is 27% Petit Verdot and 27% Merlot, and then 18% Malbec, and then we round it out with 14% each Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon. And those percentages, that composition will change year to year, and that's part of the work that George does sort of once everything's settled a little bit, is figuring out kind of how he wants to put it together, and tries a lot of different permutations and that kind of thing. So go ahead.
Yeah, there are different factors there. Sometimes the factors are purely practical, and sometimes they're what we want to achieve with a certain blend. Obviously, these grapes have a history of going together.
Right.
You know, and there are all kinds of blends out there. This blend is a little unusual in its proportions of at least for Napa, in its proportions of Malbec and Petit Verdot. But it's not an unusual combination of grape varieties. So they're the 5 red Bordeaux varieties that we talk most about now: Merlot, Malbec, Petit Verdot, Cab Franc, and Cabernet Sauvignon. But there's a lot more. So, you know, compared to these wines we've been tasting, the big difference is like, wow, phenolics, right? You've got lots of color, you've got lots of tannin. This is a wine that can absorb a lot of oxygen and age for a very long time. And it's got a lot of complexity and just the overall volume of the wine is much higher. There's a lot more flavor, there's a lot more tannin, there's a lot more impact on your palate. Yeah. And that's part of the fun. You can smell the oak. I mean, it's there as an element. You've got a mix of fruit. It's got some sort of earthy kind of dimensions to it. Sort of, I sort of think of chocolate sometimes, although there's sort of a forest floor kind of, you know, musty. I don't mean musty in a corked way, but in an earthy way.
Yeah.
And things like spices like sort of bay leaf kind of spice to it.
Yeah. This is a delicious one, and it's a really great, I think, a nice pairing wine. You know, sort of heartier cheeses, meats. Tamara writes these beautiful tasting notes. If you're ever interested, if you're ever feeling stumped or sort of want to see how your impressions sort of match up with hers or ours. Of course, this is a really personal thing, but on our website, we've got all of these tasting notes. And then she also curates our Pinterest page, and there are some really great pairing suggestions there. So that's a fun resource for for you to check out. So, you know, we've now fast forwarded, you know, for some wines, a whole year of time in the winery, and then we're getting prepared to bottle. There are a lot of things that sort of happen at that stage in order to get a wine ready to go into bottle.
Right. And sort of stabilizing wines is one of the first things we think of. And with white wines, stabilizing really comes in two forms, maybe three. If these wines are non-malolactic, which they are, if you just took them out of the container they were in and bottled them, eventually they would start to ferment again. So it's right. And that's, you know, it's happened. It will happen again, and it makes a mess, and it's a disaster. It, you know, pops corks, and the wine's bubbly and cloudy. And so these wines need to be sterile filtered. We remove the bacteria that could start this fermentation again. But beyond that, there's something we call protein stability. If you take white wines and you get them hot, if you ship them to Florida in July,
yep, which
in an unrefrigerated container, that they will develop a cloudy haze often, and that's what we call a protein instability. Tartrate stability in these wines are also a big issue. Usually with the red wines, because of the additional time they have in barrel, as long as you don't do last minute blending can create tartrate instabilities. Right.
Yeah, throws off the balance. Yeah.
But the most abundant acid in these wines, we've talked about malic acid, but tartaric acid is the most abundant. And when tartaric acid molecules combine with potassium ions, they form crystals that precipitate. And some of that is fine and natural, but when your wine bottle looks like a snow globe, it's embarrassing.
Yeah, you'd look at that and be like, something's growing in my wine. No, thank you.
So you have those levels of stability. And there are different levels of filtration. I think it's interesting, and kind of in the mid 90s, to me, there was a lot of talk about filtration, and unfined and unfiltered wines were a fairly big topic. And that seems to have gone away somewhat. I mean, I think at a minimum, you want to bottle things that you're going to have confidence with the way they'll keep in the bottle, and that's, you know, one of the starting points.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anybody who's selling wine commercially, that, you know, you're shipping and it's going to be on a store shelf for a couple months, it's going to sit in your cellar for who knows how long, you know, that's definitely important to consider. So we do a lot of that. We do all of our own bottling here, which is sort of unusual for a winery of our size.
One of the things that happened for us, we with this label, which is, you know, it's this heavy paper and it's got a torn edge on the top. Most wineries our size use mobile bottling lines. So a truck pulls up with a bottling line in the back, but all of those bottling lines, one, they make money by going fast, and they all use pressure sensitive or sticker style labels. And we weren't able to get, none of the mobile trucks had a glue labeler, and we weren't able to get this label in a pressure sensitive label. So we had to buy our own bottling line that was a glue labeler. And that's been nice. It's nice now. It was sort of an intimidating piece of machinery when it showed up with a giant stack of manuals. But it allows us flexibility in bottling. It allows us to do 100 cases of something without a big production or a single barrel, or when you ask a mobile truck to shut everything down and clean out the lines and do 25 cases of something, they say, okay, but it's going to be really expensive. And you know, having our own line is nice at this point. Yeah.
And I mentioned earlier, you know, our vineyard team, we've got a lot of really great guys there. We should mention too, our cellar team, also incredibly tenured here at Hendry. And so, you know, we've got two guys, Rafa and Luis, you know, work in our cellar, and they're managing a lot of wines, you know.
I started working with Rafa in 1986 in the vineyard here, and he graduated. Well, I mean, I don't know if graduated is the right word, but he had an interest in the winery and really took over with the cellar work mostly. And Luis is his son, who I remember being born. So I'm, you know, another confirmation that yes, I am getting older.
But I mean, so it's, I think, pretty incredible, sort of, you know, and I want to give props to them and our vineyard guys too, because they are managing a lot of work and remarkably well, and with very little.
So I feel like we're running out of time, and we've got a few questions, but let's see if we can cover like corks and screw caps very quickly.
Yes,
so you know, one of the decisions you're also making winemaking wise is what kind of package do you put it in? And I think most people at this point in time understand that there are some issues with corks. One, that they're very expensive. Two, they've traditionally spoiled a bunch of wine. And three, even if you have if you paid a bunch of money for corks that are guaranteed to not spoil your wine with TCA, which we'll skip over that quickly, but they're variable in terms of oxygen exposure. So this aging of the wine as it continues in the bottle, again, really relates to oxygen exposure. And you can find a factor of 100 difference in oxygen permeability from one cork to the next, even an expensive one. So corks still have issues. With screw caps, that they cost, less than 20% of the cost of a cork. You can tailor oxygen exposure by changing the liner in the cap. And they're all the same. So they really solve a lot of those problems. So we have a cellar full of barrels. Most of our wines are bottled in corks, but from a logical standpoint, the reasons for using natural corks are not great.
Yeah. We'd like to do, I think, more screw cap, as Mike said, but there's something less romantic when you spend a lot of money on a bottle of wine at a restaurant and they bring it out and screw off the cap rather than pop the cork. So I think that's part of the biggest barrier to moving in that direction.
I also feel like there's nothing romantic about that moment of terror when you open a special bottle of wine you've been saving for years, wondering whether or not it's been spoiled by the cork.
That is true. Yes. All right. So yeah, maybe if more people, aka you guys,
I won't miss them when they're
beating the drum for screw cap, we'll get more of those. All right, let's jump to some questions. So here's one. Doug Foster asked a question about malolactic fermentation. What are the predominant bacteria in malolactic fermentation?
Enococcus eani, O-E-O-N-N-O. It sounds spelled a little different than it sounds, but that is one that we also add a culture of. Enococcus eani.
Yep.
Yeah.
How many times, this is from Mike Clary, how many times can you use an oak barrel? That's a great question.
A lot. Hi, Mike. I hope you're doing well. It becomes a neutral container. And interestingly, so if you pay $1,200 for an oak barrel, when you've used it for 2 years, it's basically not worth anything anymore. But it becomes a neutral, so you can't sell it to anybody, but you can keep using it in winemaking. So we have some barrels that are 6 years. So what drives the turnover in our barrels is the new barrels we're buying. And this Chardonnay, for example, we use a third new barrels every year. So we have to get rid of a third to move in a third new ones. But we have some 6 or 7 year old barrels there. And if you want to, you can keep using them even longer than that. They become, a petri dish for everything that's ever been in there. So if you do have other wine spoilage issues, it's much more likely to happen in old barrels than new ones, but you can use them for quite a while.
Yeah, and when you say neutral, it's neutral in a couple of senses, but I think primarily we think about aromatically it becomes neutral, and so you're not maybe extracting quite as much of those sort of vanilla, toasty, spicy kind of aromas from the barrel. But again, there's the
and neutral financially because it can't get worth any less. Right. So I mean, there are years literally where we put 100 barrels on a truck for $1 a piece because we bought them for $1,000 and sold them for $1 a couple of years later. But it's the flavor extraction that's the reason for that, which is why things like this can be, if flavor extraction is what all the cost is over, there's the same flavor in this that there is inside that $1,200 barrel.
Right, which is to say it becomes a really personal choice of every winemaker, right? Are you using, is one of your primary purposes in using oak to get some of that aroma? Then maybe those would work too, but yes, so you can reuse them.
And if money's no object, you just stick with the barrels.
Yeah. How long should you typically keep white wine? How long is too long?
So, and this depends too. I mean, it can be a lot longer than you think and you hear out there. We have, and again, it depends what you want. If this fresh fruit, this very aromatic and floral stuff is what you like the most, then drink them fairly quickly. There's a very interesting range of flavors and textures that develop in these wines as they age. And, for our Chardonnays, I think often within 10 years, they can be great. And they can, I've had 40-year-old white wines that I think are really interesting. Now, I've had a bunch of, 7, 8, 10, 12-year-old duds, but it's, you know, there it depends. So it's partly personal. It's partly the cork lottery. I mean, one of the things for us with these, if I look in our wine library at the old Chardonnays, I can get them out, and if you put a light behind them, some are dark in color, some are very light in color, and that's a direct reflection of how much oxygen has gotten in there. And even as these wines get older and older and older, if you can find bottles that are still very light in color, they're incredible. The ones that are sort of turning brown are undrinkable. So it can depend there too.
And that's where, so it is personal. And again, we talked a little bit about those tertiary aromas, the things that come from aging. If, you know, in the case of white wine, that's often sort of a honey and, you know, kind of aroma. If you love that, then age them longer, right? You know, but if you're picking up a white wine because you love, like, you know, the fresh, bright fruit notes, then drink them sooner. And
there are styles of white wine that are all about oxidation. Madeira is an obvious one, and so all of these reactions that happen in wine, they change with temperature, and for every 10 degrees of storage, those reactions go about 10 degrees Celsius, those reactions go about twice as fast. So, you know, in terms of oxidation, so Madeira wines used to go back and forth through the tropics, and they had oxidized very quickly. So and there comes a point where they don't oxidize much more, so they sort of become the same. So they can go on and on for a long time, but the fresh fruit's gone.
Here's a question from the Montreal Hendrys. Your brother Andrew asks, why do some vintages have so many more tartrates than others?
Winemaking, I mean, mistakes maybe, and it depends how concerned you are about the tartrate. So if you're very concerned about it, then you make sure that none precipitate, but you're also removing some acid from the wine. You're removing stuff that may make it interesting years down the road. So people do debate, you know, from the point of view of the way the wine tastes, whether it's a good thing or not to take those tartrates out early. So I think our policy has varied a little bit on that over the years. And I would also say that there are some wines that wound up with more tartrates in them than we wanted. And tartrate stability it turns out is a little trickier than we, you know, it's not always obvious whether or not they're going to precipitate tartrates. There are actually additives that you can put in wine that prevent those crystals from forming. That's another way to do it. So if you want to be sure to not have any tartrates, you can add these compounds that prevent the tartaric acid molecules from linking up and forming crystals.
All right, and then our last question before wrapping up, and we've got some announcements to make, but Jeff asks, will you be tasting the fermenting Welch's? And I can't answer for Mike, but for myself, I will say
maybe. No. It doesn't smell very good. But you can see it's sort of foaming up. I thought maybe it would be like bubbling over the top by now, but but we can maybe save some for you the next time you visit.
There you go. Yeah, something to look forward to. So, well, thank you again all so much for joining. As I said at the beginning, this is our penultimate. We've got one left to go, our mailbag episode. So we've been saving all the questions that we
And then we're going straight into retirement.
Yeah. So send us your questions if you've got any more. We've got plenty of material, but we sort of want to sort of group things together if we can. So send us your ideas. We'd also really love to know if you have any ideas about how we can continue connecting with you all virtually as, you know, as we start to get into some kind of new normal. So many of you may have heard that Napa County earlier this week has launched some we're in a light reopening phase. The details are constantly changing, and the most important thing for us is that tasting rooms are not yet open. So we are so excited to see you all when that's the case. We will definitely post it on our website and let you all know. But for now, we are going to look for other ways to continue to connect with you guys. So please send us any of your ideas. We do have, if you've loved this and you want to, if you think like all of your college roommates or, you know, people on your block or something would love to do this, we do have private tastings, private virtual tastings available. So we've got some different tasting packs on our website. On the order page, you can see there's a section for private virtual tastings. So if you think that would be fun, let us know. We'd love to connect with you and your neighbors and friends and anyone that you think would love Hendry wines. So let us know. And then in the meantime, happy Memorial Day. Enjoy some good wine for us.
Also, I was kind of proud of my harvest video, and I heard that for a lot of people it just didn't work. So you can check it out on the website.
Yes, it is a beautiful video. We put a little clip of it on social media earlier this week. It is on the same videos page on our website that we have all of these if you're dying to revisit any of these topics. So it's a pretty cool video. So we encourage you guys to check it out. And
yeah, and there's another harvest video of my brother's on there, which shows multiple generations of Hendry's in child labor on the sorting line.
All right, yeah, it underscores the importance of sorting. All right, well, thank you guys all so much, and we'll see you next week. Have
Cheers.
a great weekend.
Yeah.
Bye.